Institute for Mandela Studies, highly supported by our council. So the work that we have been doing over the past few years was trying to make sense as to how the scholarly project around the Institute will take shape and what its architecture will be and how we can take it further, and of course its implication for the university in its ambition to be an African university with a strong African footprint and connection. Now, Prof. Soudien will make a few remarks as an opening address. I don't see Prof. Kolela Mangu around here, but we have Prof. Mkize here, we have Rachel Colette here, and Kinilwe Natu. So thank you so much for agreeing to spend time with us and for the preparation that you've put into your work. Of course, we have load shedding approaching us from the future, not in 2 hours' time, so no, an hour and a half. So I'm going to hand over immediately to Prof. Soudien to set the tone for us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andre. Okay, thanks very much, Andre. Thanks very much, colleagues, and thanks for coming to join us in thinking about the issue here. And I'll try and explain it a little bit because I think it does need a little bit of contextualization. So the context against which our discussion takes place here is this emerging Transdisciplinary Institute of Mandela Studies, which we are working towards building here at the Nelson Mandela University. And so what we are wanting to do in this discussion, colleagues, is to stimulate a discussion about the possibilities that might arise for the cultivation of a critical university praxis in undertaking an engagement with the name Mandela. So it's taking a little bit of what we were doing early on and putting in front of you an object and asking how this particular object might help us come to think about what a critical university praxis might be. So we're asking, Mandela, in its multiple forms of representation, is this a site from which we can begin to think critically about the world in which we live, and more importantly, a site from which and through which we might build a practice? So we're talking here about building practices, and I'll come back to this question a little later on, because I'm going to be making the argument that building practices is a really important question for us to be considering, because dominance has particular kinds of practices, and dominance is instituted in particular kinds of practices. So the problematic which sets us off here is the urgency of advancing the project of the critical university. The urgency is defined by the almost ubiquitous and totalizing capture of the university. Its overdeterminedness by managerialism and its almost now unavoidable accountabilities. It's these accountabilities that are these shaping things about what the university is all about. The university, almost everywhere in the world, and it's quite an extraordinary thing, has become commodified. It has succumbed to the corporate ideology of scorecard metricization, at the core of which is performativity. What this performativity has induced is the constitutive reordering of academic life around instrumental reason, techno-positivism, and a clientist relationship between the university and its subjects, and between the university and the state. So we were in a previous era in which, right up until maybe the 60s, and this is how the colonial university comes into being, in which the university is essentially the handmaiden of the state. Okay? I mean, that's what it is. We're in a different space now. The university is in a fundamentally clientist relationship now with what the market requires. So teaching and learning, research and social engagement have all been enclosed. Oh, welcome. It's really great. GCM. Wonderful. No, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So, as the higher education scholar Bill Reading says, the university has not only lost its fundamental commitment to critical inquiry, but has also succumbed entirely to corporatization. Its public good pretensions have been entirely eclipsed by the needs of the capitalist market. Excellence is an empty signifier based on key performance indicators that themselves depend only on activity. So this is what Reading says. All that the system requires is for activity to take place, and the empty notion of excellence refers to nothing other than the optimal input-output ratio in matters of information. And in terms of that, he says the university has now lost all content. It has become another bureaucratic corporation. Now, of course, and I made this argument yesterday. I think this is an oversimplification, pardon me, of the many and often contradictory impulses and modalities which run through the university. The university is never a singular entity or organism. It is configured always in contestation. So there's no doubt, however, so despite that, despite what I said there, there's no doubt, however, that bureaucratic commodification and its attached accountabilities have come to define what the university expects of us, to define around university life almost everywhere. This is most evident and most damagingly so in the ways in which the human subjects of the university have been constitutively, and I'm going to use that word constitutive repeatedly. You are constituted when you start studying mathematics. You are constituted when you begin the study of anthropology. You are constituted when you become a lawyer. We have in this what I call a profound re-ontologization of ourselves. So in this ontologization are powerful authorizing discourses. And the university is largely about the legitimacy of these discourses. Now, these discourses are obviously political and economic, but they are also much more problematically social. They are social, of course, in all their racial, gendered, and classed conceits. And this is the incredible thing about the South African university. The South African university is essentially a practice space for social and particularly historically white elitism. I mean, that's what it has become. But the university is insidiously much more. At the heart of this much more is an incontrovertible apotheosis, a kind of incontestable narration of the ideal modern subject. This modern subject is represented in the figure of the liberal, reasoning human being. The human being which has overcome all of history's weaknesses. The subject who stands, in Fukuyama's terms, at the end of history. The effect of this narrative is ultimately the legitimation of the kind of modernity in which we find ourselves. Its cultural impulse is to socialize us into its orthodoxies. Orthodoxies which repeatedly and insistently return us to the comfort of the dominant order and its sanctification of the underpinnings, lineaments, and substance of our normative order, and what it ought to be. The university presents itself in these terms in essentially preservative impulses, preservative. You sit in the university and it's all about preserving what we have here, because we think that what we have here is fundamentally good. So I argue that while the discursive register of the modern university is regularly framed by and in the rhetorics of inquiry, its understanding of what its basic and foundational distinctive character, that very act of inquiry, is encoded in fundamentally ideological terms. So just listen to a man called Dr. Lakish speaking in 1934 at the height of the modernist movement in the 20th century, speaking of science. South Africa's history of the universities over the last 100 years comes directly out of that. The institutions of the CSIR, the institution out of which I come, the Human Sciences Research Council, is all about this, what I'm going to read to you now. Modern science is a great movement against the unknown. This is Lakish speaking. Its purpose is unchallengeable. It aims to understand by knowing the truth. Its method is uniquely dependable. It is a new kind of strategy which aims to establish the facts, unwarped by such human frailties as prejudice and egoism. The harvest of this movement is tested and testable knowledge, therefore incontestable knowledge. So methodologically here, it is the idea that truth is achieved through objective study. Only observable facts determined through an objective distance provide the basis for determining truth. And so, yeah, this is an extraordinary thing. I mean, you will hear this repeatedly. Many people will say that actually the great gift of European civilization is this methodology. This is the great gift. Not all of these industrial revolutions, but this gift of science. And so it presents itself, as I say here, as this wonderful gift to global and civilizational development. It's incontestable. It is right. It has the object of the unquestioned public good built into it. Out of it has come what is perceived to be good science. In this good science are found what are perceived to be foundational and canonical truths. They provide a sense of certainty. Important as this posture is, it has also legitimized, and this is what we've been talking about for the last while here, intolerance, inhospitability, and it makes it difficult to see possibility outside of what this narrative is all about. So I'm asking here, and we're asking with this TIMS initiative which we're beginning here. So in the face of this dominance, what might we do? Towards answering the question here, I draw on the political philosopher Bonnie Honig, who talks about what she calls holding environments. Andre has used her work a lot. I turn that phrase slightly here away from holding environments to talk of holding cultures. Holding cultures are cultures which are able to not only hold, but also to engender, to reproduce. They reproduce the capacity and ability for particular ways of seeing, particular ways of being. Being in the university, of self and other. Dominant culture, that of commodification, and this is my argument here, has refined the art of reproduction, has refined the way in which this holding culture comes to manage itself. It has composed all of us. All of us now manage ourselves in relation to what this dominance is and its accountabilities. We almost do not have the capacity to escape it. You can't now go into any university department and say, sorry, I don't want these accountabilities, I'm going to walk away. You don't have that capacity. I mean, you can't refuse it. You are in it. So we are thinking here of another idea of what the university is all about. So we're asking here, how do we cultivate, using this idea of holding cultures, other possibilities? The possibilities not only of what this normative order is all about, but possibilities of disruption. So this difficult question is, how do you cultivate holding cultures of disruption? Right? How do you cultivate cultures that are able to engender and inspire this thing of saying, no, I refuse, and provide the conditions for its reproduction? Right? How do you engender disruption? So it's against this, the way in which I come to think about it here is to draw on Jacques Rancière, who, in talking about democracy, refers to all of these different ways in which democracy has come to manifest itself. But he says that the really complicated thing about democracy, about true democracy, is this capacity in any collective social space for always having division and living with division. Now, of course, sometimes that division can be destructive and antisocial. But he's talking about division here, which is also generative, which will allow you to take an idea and to ask how that idea doesn't come to be the final point for what we need to think about a problem. I mean, how we come to begin to think about the possibility of an idea leading to yet another idea. So we're saying to you, dear colleagues, how does the name Mandela provide us possibilities for being able to engender a culture like that? And we come to this question particularly with this work which we are now doing at Nelson Mandela University, talking to people about saying, what does Mandela mean to you? What does the name Mandela mean to you? And it's been an enormously enlightening experience. And we don't have time to talk about it here, but there is in that discussion already dissent of a kind which I'd like to just take a minute to explain. It's dissent which is very much of the register which one got out of the Fees Must Fall movement, which declared Mandela a sellout. It is that. And we have that. And that has come across. But it is also dissent which is of, in some ways, ignorance. It's like, I want nothing to do with Mandela. Don't bring me any imposition of what I must be. Leave me alone, please. Just leave me alone. So, of course, it's radical, it's the refusal, the rejection, but it's also indifference. I want to kind of say to you that indifference pervades inside of the university. These new accountabilities that we are talking about proliferate, spawn indifference. Because the self has become so privatized, so invested in my own being and my own becoming, that please just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. And so we're in this really incredible space, and I've really enjoyed doing this work here in the university, in coming to ask really hard questions of people. What does Mandela mean for engineering? Right? what does Mandela mean for mathematics? So it's easy for psychologists to make a response. It's easy for sociologists, historians, and so on, you know. But so here you are in these encoded disciplines. They're encoded. And how do you put, you know, Mandela into a relationship with this encoding? And this is what we'd really like to have the conversation about, colleagues. How do we now cultivate a critical university practice through this particular object? Thanks.
Normally you see it works, especially when I pull in my stomach like this, then the speakers, you know, immediately respond, you know, by closing. Thank you so much for that, Crain, as always. Fantastic. I am going to go from the bottom up. Yeah, no? So can you, are you okay to go first as a respondent?
Who? You.
No, can you?
It's God here.
Yeah, yes.
Well, okay.
You can.
Nashu, I'll stand. Well, evening. I'm not sure if I was already introduced, but my name is Gineilwe Nadu. I am the SRC Premier and an honor student at Nelson Mandela University. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am honored. Following the concept note, I knew that I'd like to be a part of this panel discussion. But I wouldn't say that I was not nervous about it either, and that is particularly because, one, the name of Nelson Mandela holds so much weight, you know, historical significance in South Africa. Not only that, the name, you know, is an epitome of leadership. It values humility, peace, hope, and integrity. I think this is a highly provoking conversation, the conversation that we avoid having. We've witnessed rising contestations and controversies around the name of Mandela in the past years, particularly with the Fees Must Fall movement. At the heart of Nelson Mandela's political activism was the importance of education. If anything, he believed that education was important to rescue the oppressed from the ravages of apartheid. Now, the apartheid system was extremely segregationist, and intentionally so. It was intentionally designed, where it intentionally designed the education system that served black people. Nelson Mandela played his role in transforming the socio-economic climate and status quo of the time. The passion and appreciation for the diversity and connectedness, that is one thing that I love about Nelson Mandela University. I think it's the spirit of connectedness. Mission Vale campus, now medical school, is located in a community where black people are socially disadvantaged, particularly the poor of the poorest. And yes, maybe the name of Mandela brings hope to the community, and that's where the spirit of connectedness comes in. But on the other side, we witness that hope die because of our university institutions made it apparent that education is a luxury. I think the Fees Must Fall movement, the demand for free education, made it quite difficult to completely live up to the name of Mandela. And I say this for many reasons. One being the unappreciation of radicalism by our institutions. And secondly, the challenges surrounding fees, which are over-increasing. These are challenges we have, that have become a norm to us as student activists, for a lack of a better word. To a young black person, this has become apparent that this is going to be our life, especially the past considering the advent of the Fees Must Fall movement and how basically we just ignored whatever the Fees Must Fall movement brought forth. Well, in comparison to Nelson Mandela's views on education, education should be easily accessible to South Africans for the betterment of our lives. Yes, of course, the betterment of our lives depend on it. The most sensitive issue concerns university graduates who cannot obtain their certificates to seek employment because of academic debt. Well, and lastly, at the heart of the Fees Must Fall movement is decoloniality. Now, decolonizing the education system speaks simply unto recognizing Africanity and African languages in particular in a historically oppressed nation. As a history student, I note the gaps when it comes to that, the history department in particular at Nelson Mandela University. I note the gaps when it comes to the history material, the limited history material at my disposal. Looking at the historical figure of Nelson Mandela, one would make a very huge assumption to say that Nelson Mandela University is the school for history or politics for that matter. You'd make the assumption that the institution prioritizes the history department or the politics department for that matter. I speak in front of you as one out of 10 history students, if I'm not mistaken, registered at Nelson Mandela University. And that is one, because of, I'm not going to give reasons that are going to, provoke any discussions outside of this particular gathering here. But in any case, I do have a strong belief that the name of Nelson Mandela should be accompanied by a strong history department, by prioritizing a history department that speaks to, our Africanity, that speaks to, our own identity as African people. We note also the gaps when it comes to the academic scholars at our disposal. Recently, we've had Professor Ndlovu. We're blessed with one of the oldest historians, African historians. And he basically, also highlights that language is at the heart of decoloniality. And when it comes to Nelson Mandela University, I think we should also prioritize language when it comes to decoloniality, specifically because mostly here at Nelson Mandela University, you'd find that most students that are registered are from rural areas, are from the most, poorest of the poor, quartile, did they call them quartile one? Yes, quartile one, where we are not familiar with laptops, when we are not familiar with, the big English word and word for that matter. So I think it's important when it comes to also learning and teaching that we look into language, that we use a language that is more accessible or rather accommodating to Black poor students. And that is aligned with the name of Mandela. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kinilwa. We are synchronous now. As I stood up, she was closing her presentation. It's beautiful, eh? So the idea of Mandela and history, Mandela and language, Nomalanga, something to take forward in our further discussion, of course, tied to the displacement of the radical Mandela that we also have to consider from time to time. I'm going to ask Oh, and my apologies for not introducing you. I feel so bad about that. So we have now Rachel, who is from our Fine Arts Department, the lecturer there. From Malanga, from our History Department. Prof. Kolela is from the George Washington University. And now I have done all the introductions, you see, so that I don't make the same mistake again. You know, there you are. Rachel, over to you.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's there. There we go. From there. Perfect. Thank you. Can I do that? That's showing? What's not showing? Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay, thank you. Yeah, firstly, I just want to say thank you to Andre for inviting me / pressuring me into being here. But I've really felt so privileged to be here the last 2 days, and it's kind of reconnected me to the purpose of, academic research and teaching, and that's very valuable. So my contribution is going to attempt to draw a connection. In light of the proposition of the Transdisciplinary Institute for Mandela Studies, I'm going to attempt to draw a connection between what Prof. Crain was referring to as the corporatization of the university, and then how is that connected to how we've used Nelson Mandela's image at this university in order to ask how the critical scholarship that's being done on Mandela by scholars such as, Prof. Mangu and Professor Shireen Hassim, how might that depth of scholarship that I've witnessed be brought more into the consciousness of students and academics outside of these spaces? So, as Sibukazi pointed out earlier, the visual environment of a university is important. There's this fantastic PhD thesis by Philippa Mtumbueni, who wrote about the physical layout of the spaces at the University of the Free State. And she was saying how, looking at how the physical spaces allowed or disallowed certain forms of engagement between different student groupings and between students and staff. And as part of that, she argues that, as the French philosopher Henri Lefebvre says, physical space helps construct social space, and representations in space provide the environment of and the channel for communication. So I wanted to look briefly at the public sculptures that represent Mandela at this university and offer a brief reading of those in relation to Mandela as an icon of simultaneously ideal African and cosmopolitan citizenship. But to contextualize the way that Mandela has been used at this university, I want to look at general kind of portraiture of Mandela that has come out of the so-called post-apartheid era. So here I'm drawing on Professor Lisa van Roberik's article about the visual Mandela. And in this article, she makes the case that artistic portraits, like paintings and sculptures, tend to elide the contingent nature of indexical signs that photographs capture. So she takes as one example this example of Paul Emsley's monumental, it's more than a meter high, pencil portrait of Mandela. And she points out that the artist has made here a series of decisions to portray the sitter without context, to focus on his face, the seat of interiority, to portray him in black and white, and to ask his subject not to smile. And the result, she argues, is that the viewer is invited to believe that they can read Mandela's unique and coherent singular interiority through his portrait. And this was one of the functions of the modern Western portrait, to convey this idea of the unique individual self that one can see in the subject, and to somehow capture that. And the modern portrait is conceived of at the same time as the self is understood as individual and unitary, and importantly, as a political subject who had rights and also political responsibilities of citizenship. So Van Roberik points out the Mandela presented here is a particular version of Mandela. Mandela as a self-commanding, stoic, modern subject who portrays moral authority and epitomizes the ideals of modern global citizenship. And this is a version of Mandela that she argues was especially appealing to neoliberalism, and it's the same kind of representation used by Barack Obama. So the only sign of his particular time and place here is his shirt. And the Mandela shirt is interesting because it's a multivalent signifier. When he was asked by why he wore such shirts, Mandela apparently answered that he'd been in prison for 27 years and that he wanted to feel freedom. So the shirt is a symbol of freedom and also of the power to reject the Western suit. But it also symbolizes Mandela's ideal of cosmopolitan global citizenship as expressed in part of his Rivonia trial statement, where he said, and I quote, "I've been influenced in my thinking by both West and East. I should tie myself to no particular system of society other than that of socialism. I must leave myself free to borrow the best from the West and from the East." The Mandela shirt sculpture, completed in 2015, here, is the largest artwork symbolizing Mandela on campus. It's made of white ceramic tiles, which give white and blue ceramic tiles, which give color to it, but predominantly it's made of this wire mesh, which gives it this suggestion of transparency. And interestingly, the person of Mandela is not present here. It is now a shirt that's not filled by a body. It's more an explicit tribute to the value system abstracted from the particularities of Mandela, the person. So it's also interesting to look at the situation where it was placed. So situated outside of the main building, managerial power and the idea of moral citizenship and leadership are brought into proximity. Then this is another image used in marketing of postgrad courses. So a lot of these images of the public sculptures have been used extensively to market the university. Then another image of Mandela is present outside the South Campus Library. This was unveiled in 2018, and it's a bronze sculpture that portrays also the Mandela of the era of the Mandela shirt, reading this large book, seated on a bench. In some ways, it's quite different to the monumental shirt. It's not placed on a plinth. It invites participation. Taking part in a different convention of bringing public heroes to the people. It's accessible. But in light of critical university studies, it's also interesting to ask what form of participation does it invite? The bench is frequently used as a selfie opportunity by students, alumni, and visitors. Yeah. It's also, like the shirt, extensively used in marketing. Here you can also see how it's used to promote a certain idea of student life on campus. The image of Mandela reading this generic book, situated in relation to the library and the main building, which you can see behind it from the front, this functions to sanction the form of education being offered here. But visualizing Mandela in relation to education, as you suggested earlier, could also be used to explore the range of provocations that have been raised about the nature, purpose, and accessibility of that education. So Van Robberich argues that the representation of the ideal, coherent, cosmopolitan synthesizer, that Mandela, functions as this kind of big other, she says, following Lacan. And this icon interpolates the viewer, hailing us as citizens of the kind that he represents, or this particular version of him represents. So in the TIMS survey of what students, staff, and the public associated with the name of Mandela, it was interesting to note one of their findings that the majority of respondents related to Mandela on a symbolic level, as a purveyor of values, as opposed to a historical, political level. So these artworks provide an important point of connection to Mandela on campus. You know, they also face the challenges of public sculpture, which do have to speak to a broad audience. And you know, presenting something that's difficult to live with in public and discomforting is also, you know, a particular challenge to get funding for. But these artworks are also, you know, beautifully crafted and show care. And I'm not taking aim at their value, because they are this connection point to the figure of Mandela that would otherwise be completely absent. But from here, a challenge would be to articulate in calls for artworks, in what's pitched for. You could articulate an interest in different inflections of Mandela's image. The challenge could be to resist the appeal for reinforcing images of Mandela as a single unified ideal subject and show not only various stages of Mandela's life and the different roles that he played, but also relational aspects of his subjectivity as highlighted by various colleagues. So, for example, in relation to his mother, his father, to DDT Jivavu, to the poet Samuel Mackay, to Evelyn Mandela, Winnie Mandela, and Graça Machel. So can Mandela University embrace experimental and discomforting forms of visual representation of Mandela? And this is just one way that the nuance of scholarship that I've seen here, and in previous colloquiums about Mandela, how that's just one way that this kind of nuance could be more present in the campus environment, generally speaking. There's so many other ways that have been suggested, like in the course of the TIMS engagement, Dr. Moeng spoke about a grounding module that would encourage critical reflection on Mandela as a way of providing students, and I quote, with a conceptualization that would assist them in tackling issues of human rights, the economy, and life beyond the classroom. Then there's also been the suggestion to have a stronger focus on innovation and entrepreneurship. I'm nearly done. And I know that the concept of entrepreneurship has been, problematized here. But if we take it back to the idea of innovation and creativity, I think that's a very valuable observation by one of the students in those engagements where they asked them how they felt about the name. So there's also been the suggestion of a module that centers biography. So in the concept note, or just to pause very briefly. Basically I'm using the visual as a kind of metaphor for the accretion of dominant narratives and tropes. Because I think that, you spoke about the indifference, to Mandela, and where does that indifference come from? Because I think part of where it might come from is this repetition of one-dimensional narratives about Mandela, and from ignorance. So how does the scholarship that is so rich here come down to an everyday level? Thanks. Escape. I can't move the mouse. Okay.
It's fine. Oh, thank you so much, Rachel. Oh yeah, I can see why I sort of pressurized Rachel to be part of this panel. So great stuff, colleagues. And we are just constrained by time, and my apologies for that. People are actually sticking very well to the 8 to 10 minutes. So I'm going to ask Nomalanga and then Kolela, and then see if we can't have a little discussion around the presentations. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Norma.
Okay, thank you so much. I was also pressured. Yes. In the corporate university, I figured that one of the only ways to make the corporate university listen is to use its own language. And so I used their cost center to order myself a book called Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast. So that's a beautiful book, and I just have a summary of the lesson of that book is this: no matter how well designed your strategic plan is, it will fall flat unless your team shares the appropriate culture. Right? So that's what I want you to put at the heart of your terms, not the survey, not the language, that idea that your strategy will fall flat if people can't share an appropriate culture, even amongst many cultures in an institution. So let me also try to start with a story about a friend of mine. She's Ugandan Rwandese, and she's telling me the story of how she was in a coffee shop in the US. And we come from the NGO sector there in Cape Town, which is a very hectic sector, right? NGO sector, or that thing that leads people to talk about George Soros and all that kind of stuff. And as black people in the South African NGO sector, we obviously had our own views about that sector, especially in Cape Town. Anyway, so she tells me the story. So we're talking about being black and trying to retain your black self, you know, amongst all this liberal funded nonsense that happens in the NGO sector. And she tells me the story of going to America, being there in a coffee shop, and she's talking to, I think, whichever white person was hosting her or whatever it was in the coffee shop. And she says this black American is sitting right across them, a total stranger, and watching this conversation. And just at some point, this black American stands up and goes to them. So it's a black woman and this white, she's young, this white person, and she goes to him and says, "Don't you ever think we can't see what you're trying to do to her?" Meaning, to this white person, don't think we don't see what you're trying to do to this white black child. And she says that changed her life, because she was literally sitting there with this NGO person, and it forever broke her idea that she was only in the world as a particular kind of, you know, free, independent creature. There was a whole black surveillance to see, is this child still fine? Okay? And unfortunately for her, she had no option, because this black person stood up and said, and that is one of the difficult things of dealing with a project like the Mandela Project, because for black people to share the story of Mandela with those who did not accept Mandela is very hard. The reason that I think this generation calls Mandela a sellout is not because I think they think he's a sellout. They don't want to share him with white people. And they don't want to share him with white people, not because they don't think he should be shared, but they don't want to share their grandfather in a way that disrespects his very deep legacy. So it's like your grandfather coming home, and now your grandfather is being nice to the people that bullied you, and you're like, but how mkulu, how now, how mkulu? And Mkulu's like, no, otherwise there's going to be a war in the village if we don't. And you're like, mkulu, but these ones. It is legitimate for black people across the continent to not want to share Mandela with people that never understood what Mandela meant to them. So Crain, that is the culture issue we have to get into, all right? And so to deal with this Mandela Project really for me is about that issue and coming to terms with the psychology of black people trying to make sense why he must be Tata Madiba. Why? If you don't even know that if you can't even, why must I share him with you? I don't want to share him with you. And so I think what's happening then here at this university is working with that and trying to make sense of a person who came to his own statesmanship and the apex of his global leadership was in saying, look, there's going to be a war in this village, and I need to find a way for trust to be engendered sufficiently such that we can actually build a living community, right? And what did Mandela do? Did Mandela not have to tell the young men to throw their AK-47s into the sea after Chris Hani was killed? Mandela had to do that, right? So we all know the stories where Mandela had to do that, and it's deeply painful for black South Africans to have to deal with the white South Africans who can't understand what that means to us. Even the child who was not born at the time inherits that memory, right? So we need to come to terms with that culture question on all the sides of this. And I think what I realized then, from a practical level, is we had a long chat about this yesterday, in dealing with the Mandela Project and trying to intellectualize it, is when we are sitting here at this institution, which has all the hallmarks of everything, right? I mean, if you don't know, this was a right-wing institution of the highest order. Okay, we're talking Bruderbond, right? And today, 80% of the students are black, and Nomalanga can come and tell you things, right? So we see lots of changes. But how do we really dream that says to the black child, I am not disrespecting your ownership of the grandfather or of Mandela, the fighter, But we're going to have to build a place in which the concept of sustaining a dream can actually be enacted. Because all around us, really, we just see failure, and inability to really deal with the legacies that are passed down to us. So I thought maybe there are some ideas here. The first is that, what are the practices of using power? You spoke about practices. So what are the practices of using power? There's a very deep question of culture. If you're sitting there and grandfather is using grandfather's ability to say, no, there can't be a war in this village, what is the strategy that is happening there? How are we using power to manage the tensions and conflicts in our institutions? I know UCT is struggling with this question. How do we practice institutional relationship cultivation? First I thought relationship building, then I was like, no, those terms don't make. How do we cultivate relationships? All right? When people first meet, now let me be a bit reductive. When certain kinds of white people meet me, they read me as a very radical person. But if you ask any black student, they'll tell you I'm highly conservative, right? Those are not contradictions, by the way, and I'll end with why that isn't a contradiction. But, you know, a black woman who just speaks with her mind must be a problem, right? But now, when we have to sit together against the management over there, I find relationality in this institution because we, you know. So those are the things. Just to list them off quickly. The practice of relational cultivation, the practice of building communities, and finally, the practice of building trust, and building trust in African intelligence and African solidarities. Because in the end, what you want to figure out is how to create these cultures. Can I just end with saying that the reason I started with the coffee shop story is because it's my experience that black students are highly skeptical for good reasons and for just being young reasons of whether these ways of running things actually achieve anything for black people in the end. And I think we have to find ways to engender real trust, to build a culture that says, yes, this will eventually, this thing we are doing here is going to benefit you. It's going to create the conditions in which we can create a sustainable dream. So those are just some thoughts. I'm really responding directly to your paper there. Thanks.
Yeah, I've pressured a number of people on this panel, it seems like it. Nomalanga, as always, new angles, new insights, whenever you share your thoughts with us. So thank you so much for that. Kolela, it's now your turn. You'll be the last speaker. And this panel has been, okay, now listen to me now. This panel has been so great in sticking to the time. You have 10 minutes, my brother.
Thank you. Thank you, man. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Let me start with explaining my, I suppose, relation to Mandela. And going back in the 1980s, I was a radical leader of the Black consciousness movement at Wits University. And there was, the natural divide, ideological divide, right? And I was a critic of Mandela. I was an open critic of Mandela. And then and now. And the question is not actually whether one is a critic of Mandela, but what are the terms of the criticism? And a scholar, I believe those terms should be scholarly. In as much as I bring my politics into it, in as much as I disagree with him politically, what is my intellectual engagement with this figure? Not even this person, but with this symbol. So let me start by saying that I've tried over the past 8 years writing a book about Mandela to position myself as somebody living outside of South Africa. Because I know the South Africa part, I know the history in and out. I was part of it, I was active in it. Many years ago, in 1997, I visited India at the behest of the Barefoot College in India. And this college is in one of the poorest parts of India. And as the host, guy called Banker Roy, took me around, we came to this group of elderly people. I mean, I've seen poverty, but I had never seen poverty like that. And of course, they did not speak English. And so I couldn't have a conversation with them. And then we walked away, and I said to Banker, wait a minute. I'm going to go back and ask them a question in English, even if they don't understand. And I said, do you know Nelson Mandela? And all of them nodded in agreement. Banker, of course, translated. And they were almost like, what do you take us for, right? Now, this is in the furthest parts of the world in India, in rural India. A year later, I was at Harvard University, and Harvard had decided to give Mandela what's called a special honorary doctorate, right, at a specially convened gathering of the university. The university had never done that in over 200 years. The only people who had ever been given that award was George Washington in 1776, Winston Churchill in 1945, and Mandela in 1998. And there is a paradox, in a sense, in this global recognition of Mandela and in this dismissal of Mandela in our own land. Now, this is not unique to Mandela, by the way. George Washington, right, was rejected, actually, by large numbers of the American public, who saw him as a wannabe royal, who thought he had a dangerous monarchical demeanor. He wanted to impose himself as a king of a democratic republic. Charles de Gaulle, the celebrated French leader, was at once considered the most revered figure in French history, but also the most hated. Mikhail Gorbachev was regarded as the greatest statesman in the history of 20th Russia, but was also the most widely despised. And so there's nothing new in this. And what I'd like us to do is to say, what is it, right, that what leads societies to do that? I wish I was a psychoanalyst. Maybe I would be able to explain it. But it seems to me that there's a difference between the immediacy of the moment and how the person is viewed over time, right? And there's no single Mandela for a particular time. So guess what? Call him a sellout, whatever you like. 50 years from now, another generation may look differently at the situation, as generations have done all around the world. It is part of, I suppose, part of the process of national self-identity building. I want to point to certain paradoxes and ambiguities and ironies in Mandela, and how we might, in thinking about the Institute, use them as part of further research, if you like. And in so doing, I'm going to try and kind of illustrate the ignorance, right, the intellectual ignorance on which we sit when we talk about Mandela. The first paradox is, of course, that Mandela, all right, here is this revered leader, radical revolutionary, who comes from a family that were allies of the colonial government. Now, you won't see that in any of the biographies of Mandela. You won't see it anywhere, actually, right? That his family fought alongside the colonialists to defeat the Xhosa. And that's why it's important not to confuse the Tembu and the Xhosa in that history. Why is this important? Okay, let me make a second point. Mandela became part of an African elite, right? Mission-educated elite, trained at Fort Hare, a very small group of people in the African community. And in the Cape, those folks had the right to what was called a qualified franchise. It was a non-racial qualified franchise. Okay? African people in the Cape, the elite at least, had been voting since 1853 until it was ended in 1936. Right? So they were part of this idea of a universal, a qualified franchise. These two things suggest to me a certain ambiguity. 5 minutes? Yeah, I'll manage. They suggest a certain ambiguity about the political struggle, which I hope will put paid to the notion, entertained by many radicals, that our struggle was this kind of one stream of revolutionary upheaval with no room for compromise. Not true. Even during the wars of the resistance, African communities allied themselves with colonial governments in order to gain advantage against other communities. Again, not peculiar to South Africa. It happened all over Africa, it happened all over the world and among colonized people. What I'm trying to illustrate with these anecdotes, and that's what I hope the Institute will do, is to bring to light the ambiguities, the paradoxes, and the contradictions of struggle. That to negotiate with the enemy, I mean, in writing this book, I've been reading letters written at the dictation of Maqoma, written by Charlie, written by all these African resistance leaders, calling for compromise with the British. And they were doing that in order to have time to go to the fields and plant in the fields. African people have always been pragmatic long before the term pragmatism came into use. But it was always a radical pragmatism, not the vacuous manner in which that term is used. All right? So even as we like to think of ourselves as revolutionaries, even as we like to think of ourselves as putting ourselves in this revolutionary history, we may have to actually appreciate more what that history was like before we place ourselves in it. And to me, it's vital to our understanding of leadership. And I do this, of course, comparing Mandela with leaders all over Africa and all over the world. The second point, in addition to this ambiguity, is what I call the tragedy of Mandela. Why am I using tragedy? Tragedy helps us escape some of the issues that were dealt with here over the past couple of days about the problems with modernity and how we look and the Enlightenment and all of that. Right? I go back 5,000 years, right? Long before the onset of Western modernity. And through tragedy, I'm able to look at Mandela's life through a different lens, right? From the lens that we are all using. So it's not like we don't have choices, all right, in terms of viewing Mandela. There's a scholar called Northrop Frye, and I'm going to end on this. Northrop Frye wrote a book about how history is written, right? And he kind of broke it into 4 broad categories according to the seasons of the year, right? So you've got the romance writing. And that's how Mandela's life has been written, right? As romance. okay? And then you've got what he called comedy, right? Comedy as in like reconciliation, not as in like, making people laugh, right? Well, I suppose people laugh when they reconcile, right? So Mandela has been written through these two frameworks, right? And you can see it in the metaphors. Romance, the romantic leader, the triumph, the triumphant leader, right? And comedy, right? Reconciliation, the rainbow nation, right? Those are the metaphors. Then there's a third one, there are four of them. There's a third one that Fry writes about, which is satire, right? And he writes that, and this is idea, satire can go two ways. One, just give me 2 minutes, man. Right? Satire can go in two ways, right? Satire can be what I was doing when I was criticizing Mandela, right? It's that sense of irony that we all need, okay? But satire can be dangerous when it leads into cynicism. That's what Fry writes, right? Especially in a context of cultural degradation, right? Especially in a culture like where there's no respect or appreciation for history. And in that context, satire can evoke the worst in the human imagination. Finally, tragedy, which is my favorite, naturally, right? You go and read the Greek tragedies, okay? They, in many ways, and the thing about the Greek tragedies is that they are informed by the African experience. I mean, Greece and Egypt and all of those, they're intertwined. So if you want to look at Mandela through the African lens, it would seem to me, we should do what other African leaders have been doing, actually, other African writers, Wole Soyinka, Achebe, Rotimi. African folks, African academics outside of South Africa have been using tragedy to study their own condition. It is a sign of our own displacement, of our own distance from the African political and cultural and literary imagination that we have not used tragedy to look at Mandela. Because it is when we look at tragedy, right, that we begin to appreciate suffering. Not triumph, suffering as the basis of what it means to be human, right? What humando, right? What Cornel West calls grappling with death, right? And it is when we look at Mandela in that way that perhaps we can grow some empathy for his suffering. And maybe it is a romantic framework that lends him to being called a sellout. But perhaps a tragic framework might help us look at him more empathetically, even as we do so critically. Thank you. Have a good night.
No, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kolela. In fact, this is coming back to more or less what all the panel participants are saying, from Kenilwe onwards, the centering history within the university, which is the project that you are pursuing, Kolela, critical history. And of course, Rachel's injunction that the proper scholarship around Mandela requires a better landing within our university spaces, and how can that happen outside of the branding projection of Mandela. And then, of course, Nomalanga's insights as to the relationship that young people have been cultivated for what reasons around the notions and the social figure of Mandela as well. So here we have that, of course, located within the concept note that Crain has written. Crain, do you still think that we should go for that little group chat?
I don't know. So it's 20 to 8.
Can you just more or less organize yourselves like three, just groups of 3 and see? Is that okay? Or shall we rather go for questions because we're running out of time? Okay. Okay, right. Now we have, when we move to questions and everybody's hands came up. But I've got the first 3 and I'm going to, right, so we have 1, okay, right. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to stay with that now and see whether we can make it before load shedding hits us. Bongani, you go first now. Of course, as you may well know, we only have 15 minutes, and we have to get through the questions, and we have to get through the panelists. Nah? I don't have to say more, Mos. I trust the young people at Nelson Mandela University.
Greetings to the house at large. You know, Prof Kit, I was not going to speak, but Prof Mangu is one of the most greatest academics I've had the honor to listen to, on the basis that he is probably one academic who has managed to resuscitate the dignity of Nelson Mandela from 2019 in the series of the Mandela Studies. He was here, by the way.
For those 2 lectures.
I'm very emotional as I speak. Prof Mangu.
But
Prof Mangu.
Yeah.
You spoke that the understanding of Mandela, his sellout or progress within the struggle, is determined by the generation in which those who understand him live in. One, do you presuppose that the generation between...
Shall we stick it to one question, Bongani, please?
Okay,
No?
one question.
Yeah. No, finish the question properly.
Do you presuppose that... Okay, one question. Do you presuppose that the generation of 1990 to 1994 saw Nelson Mandela as progressive, even though that we achieved political democracy and not economic democracy? And what then does the teams have to say about that in respect of rebranding Mandela going forth with the trajectory? Thank you.
Thank you, my brother. In fact, I love young people, you know, and the way they go around the regulations, you know. One question, and then instead of a full stop, you put an end. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Let's go. Thank you so much for that, Bongani. To the back. And then Lucky, and then there at the end. Yeah, thank you so much. Nadia, can you hand the mic over to Lucky so long?
Can I start talking? Greetings, everyone. My name is Cyril Mpisi. I'm from the Human Sciences Research Council in Cape Town. I also had about 3 questions, but because of time, I'll only ask one. So my question is really on the use of transdisciplinary as a heuristic term or device, as opposed to other terms such as interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. What does transdisciplinary speak to or capture or espouse or hope to achieve, especially when it comes to studying Mandela critically, that the other terms do not? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Lucky?
Thank you. I hope my question will make sense, you know, without the background that I had prepared. When we try to define society or a space, like for example, we're trying to define, you know, the Nelson Mandela University, you know, against the name Nelson Mandela. I'm just wondering, and this is not directed to any individual, but maybe all of us, in the singling out of individuals, you know, to take one individual and put them out there and then maybe look at their values. Is that, I don't want to say is it African, but I mean, is that the best approach, you know, to just maybe single out certain individuals and maybe want to build around that? Or should we be looking at the societal values without really singling out a particular individual and build from that? Thank you.
Fortunate, can you just ask the person to type the question in, and then you can zap it to me on WhatsApp? Thank you so much. Please go ahead, and we've got a number of questions that I still have to engage with here from WhatsApp. I'm so sorry. Please go ahead, and thank you so much for that, Lucky.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I'll just make a quick comment and then ask my question. On the question of Mandela being viewed as a sellout, I think that discussion ought to be within the correct political discourse, historical, on the clear expectations of liberation on struggle objectives, as rallied by Mandela's liberation movement. I thought you were going to speak on this, Prof. Mango. Because so long as we detach the struggle objectives to the question of selling out or not, we will miss the point. And this, Prof, does not even become a Mandela issue. I'm now coming to the latter speaker's comments.
We have to get to the question, my brother.
Yes, yes. It doesn't become a Mandela issue. What I want to ask as a question is, why is it that we single out Mandela outside his collective colleagues, whom he struggled with, such that the victories or the failures of that struggle would befall on that collective? You see, because that's the trap now that we put the Mandela name on, in that he takes a fall of a collective, not of his own. The man was in prison for 27 years for that matter, such that when he comes out now, he will then be this particular figure above. Now, the other question I want to ask, okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, I love you guys for that. Thank you so much for just tolerating, the fact that I need to manage the time. I have to just get through the questions here, and I'm going to start from that side, and I'm going to ask Crain to close, and everybody's going to get a chance to respond to whatever you feel you would like to respond to. And please also just project the discussion into the context of our broader African project, that we are gathering here for. Do note some of the questions that I'm going to read out now. The one is from Ruby Ann. How do we address the humanizing approach and primacy of relationality that Mandela used, which is also a question that was raised yesterday, and how this was and continues to be taken advantage of by those who do not identify with the African culture. That was also actually came through in various discussions as well. And then, she phrased that against the backdrop of the massive inequalities and, who owns the economy. And then, okay, right. So there's only one question then. Oh, it was a long, okay, right. So there's that particular question. But it gives us 12 minutes. And, of course, you can manage yourself here as a panel. Kinilo, you want to go first, or you they can go first. They can go. Okay, right, sure. Then I'll ask Nomalanga, then Rachel, then Kinilo. Is that okay with you then?
Yes, I can go last.
No, I want the Prof. Soudien to go last. Will you go before Prof. Soudien?
Okay. Anyhow.
Yes. Okay, right. Please.
Okay, well, just in relation to that comment and what you said about radical pragmatism and what I said about my being a conservative when I'm not really, but that's the point precisely, that there is no black struggle that is scorched earth only. Otherwise you will die in your own struggle. And that is what the liberal position has taught black students for the past 30 years, that you can scorch earth your own society and survive. You cannot. And that is why this one is important. Because at some point, we have to, what you were saying, looking at the history and saying, well, it was not actually Mandela, it was actually Oliver Tambo. Actually, it was not just Oliver Tambo. It was a constellation of your political ancestors. And the belief that you are so much brighter than them is arrogant for any of us to think we are so bright. Shame, Oliver Tambo was dumb. So the moment that radical pragmatism is the inheritance of real African struggle across the world. And I'm not talking about the collaborationist aspect, but the aspect that says we struggle so we can live, not because we're going to do scorched death. Besides, coming from KZN, you don't want to know what scorched death means. You will never survive it. Yeah. In fact, on the last point about Mandela as a military leader, I think Andrew Odendaal emphasized this point again. It takes the political intelligence to hold back your military wing, to say now is the time for politics, not war. And it takes a great, that's why I said in the end, for us to build trust, we have to take African intelligence very seriously. Yeah.
Thanks. I think the only question I really want to respond to is about the forms of memorial and why one individual is singled out, and that it may not have been addressed to me, but it made me think about how across Africa after independence there are these bronze sculptures of leaders that are erected, and it's usually of one particular man, and that is a particular form of memorialization that, you know, I don't necessarily want to say it's a particularly Western form of memorialization, but you can see it. But there are other ways of remembering, even visually, that have to do with like forms of monuments, like in Rwanda, where they have, you know, still the houses of people that you can go and visit, or like remnants of real things that you can see, or in Germany where they have the names of the people that died on that particular street, that people go out and the whole community goes out and cleans those things. So there are more participatory, sort of broader forms of memorial out there. So a question that comes to mind for me is why doesn't South Africa utilize those forms more? Yeah.
Quickly, first of all, right, there should be no one position on Mandela, all right? In fact, for me, the Institute should be a basis, right, for all kinds of intellectual, scholarly engagement with Mandela, right? I should be able to disagree with Mandela, and I do, and if you search enough, you'll find I criticized him 9/9, right? With him talking, I don't agree with you on this, and all of that, right? Especially on questions of race more than anything. If you look at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, you will see a paper that I wrote in which I criticized him. What I disagree with are the insults. And that I really, really find objectionable. Second, what were we fighting for? There's no one answer to that, you see. What were the struggle objectives? No. The ANC, if you look at the ANC, right? The ANC until 1943, was a liberal organization. In fact, its document, which no one in the ANC speaks about today, is the African Claims. It's the most liberal. If the South African Constitution of 1994 is closer to the African Claims, right, than to the Freedom Charter, or a mix of both. So it depends on where the negotiations take place, okay? And at the time of the negotiations, right, the objectives were really about racial freedom. There had been within the ANC a whole contest about whether this was a class struggle or a racial struggle. And Mandela and them and Katrada and them wrote an essay, I don't know if you're aware of this, called Marxism and Inqindi. And in that essay they say Marxism is not the policy of the organization, that communism is not the policy of the organization, that the Communist Party is not the leading agent of the organization, that this is a struggle for racial freedom. All right? So we must look at the archive itself to see what these people... Finally, you know, nobody in their right mind would elevate Mandela above other people. And that's not what biography is about, right? So when I say I'm using tragedy, right? If you look at Greek tragedy, there is a hero, but the hero is always part of the action, right? So that when the hero dies, the action continues. So that's what Raymond Williams teaches us. So it's not that we shouldn't talk about individual heroes. It's how we talk about them in relation to their comrades, in relation to their communities. Finally, Mandela was the most, in the negotiations, he was the least compromising of his comrades. Go to the minutes of the ANC meetings. Mandela was the one who was saying, comrades, no, you are compromising too much now. You are compromising too much on this and this and this. All right? What's that guy? The guy who bombed a place in Cape Town and was arrested and sent to prison. Anyway, this guy was arrested, sent to prison, and the National Party said, we're not going to talk to you, or the ANC was demanding that this guy be released. I'm a Neamazman. Who's that guy? From Cape Town. The guy who bombed a restaurant. Huh? The guy, man, the Mkondo guy who bombed a place and children were killed in Cape Town. Was it in Cape Town or Durban?
No, it was
Yeah? Marcus. Who's the guy? What's his name?
McBride.
McBride.
That's not Cape Town.
Okay. McBride. Okay. McBride. Do you know that when de Klerk and them, right, refused to release McBride, members of the ANC were saying, hey, comrades, okay, you know what? Let's not hold the line on this. We'll deal with this later. And Mandela said, McBride is released or there are no negotiations. He's standing on this position that unless you guys release McBride, there will be no negotiations. Mandela was the most hardened of those negotiators. Go look at the minutes.
Thank you, Kolela.
Okay, no, our prof already said a mouthful. So I'm just going to conclude by saying that I think the important question should be whether the university is able to keep up with the name of Mandela, whether the university is able to sustain the expectations that comes with the name of Mandela. Also considering that we place him in a very, significant place in history. And also I think the academic space must, in a sense, pay reparations to this particular debate by appreciating African scholarship, in that way, the way in which institutions operate should be is in total contradiction of what, Mandela initially stood for. So I think in order for the institution to pay total reparations to this discourse, we should, pay more attention to African scholarship.
That's fantastic, Niwa, thank you.
No, this has been a great discussion. So just to say, colleagues, the provocation was, does TIMS offer possibility as a site for critical university studies? And that's the provocation. And I think the way in which the discussion has gone here, and this is no, if you like, excuse for coming to focus on the individual here. It's how this particular subject is constituted. And what we're hearing here, and I think it's really crucial, and so I appreciate what Nomalanga has said about trust. What we're beginning with here is first of all the absolute, if you like, availability of a conversation like this for the university to model a different practice. To begin to think about a practice which is completely different I mean, to the way in which history, a lot of our history is managed and taught. So it's about how we come to methodologically think about a subject. And it's a really crucial thing.